Hey guys, welcome to my first theory video. While I do plan on making theory videos that are completely original, this one is going to be more of a response to Lockstin and Gnoggin's first video in regards to Sun and Moon being the climactic ending of Pokémon. I will provide an annotation in this video and a link in the description below to watch his video. As I will be referencing the video a lot, I would suggest you watch that video first. It's about 45 minutes long, but I promise it's very interesting and most definitely worth a watch. Alright, you've watched it now? Great, let's get on to the theory. So, essentially, my theory exists as a result of not believing Lockstin and Gnoggin's conclusion of Sun and Moon being the end of the main line of Pokémon games, or at the very least, the end before a reboot. The majority of the video explains the connections between the storylines of the Pokémon games, specifically from Gen 4 through Gen 7, but more on that later, and alchemy. Personally, there's so much evidence given in the video that I accept most of it as fact, and will treat it as such for the purpose of this video. All I disagree with is the conclusion. I do not believe the storyline will end. Furthermore, this will not only be a theory on why I don't believe the main line of games will end, but also on what the future of the main line of games will look like. Now, before I go into my lore reasoning of why I believe Sun and Moon will not be the end, I would like to acknowledge the money side of why I don't believe it will be the end. Granted, I came up with this theory before Lockstin and Gnoggin made the video in which they discussed this very topic, but even after watching it, I still believe money will not allow them to stop producing mainline Pokemon games, nor create a reboot. While a reboot might seem to create more of a profit because of Pokemon Go, it's risky. Nintendo was lucky with Pokemon Go, but success in having Gen 1 games being most important isn't guaranteed. As said, in the Gen 1 video, although Gen 1ers, what certain Pokemon fans have decided to call those who only like Gen 1, sometimes Gen 2, and rarely any of the other gens, make up the majority of Pokemon fandom, there is still a significant amount of fans who will take anything from Pokemon regardless of the gen. This minority usually doesn't approve of Gen 1ers' views either, so pandering toward them could greatly affect the current fandom that Pokemon has. At this point, it's a big risk to hope that all the original fans of Pokemon will come back for a reboot and not financially secure. If Nintendo wants to reboot, they would have to do so while still maintaining the main line of Pokemon games. Now, as for the lore behind the Pokemon games, I don't think an ending nor a reboot is in its future, simply because there are pieces of a puzzle missing, parts of a timeline we know exist but haven't been told anything about. It's similar to the reasoning behind the recent reveal that the new Star Trek series set to release next year, Star Trek Discovery, will be taking place before the original series and after Enterprise, despite almost all fans wanting it to take place after Next Generation Voyager and Deep Space Nine era. The simple reasoning behind this is that we know there was a period of time before the original series and after Enterprise, but we didn't know much about it, and it would be difficult to move on into the future of the timeline without first making sure that the holes in the past are filled, to avoid making any mistakes. So where does this play into Pokemon? Well, there's a whole separate universe worth of holes that we have yet to see. I'm putting up a picture of what I believe the Pokemon timeline looks like, or at least what I believe it will look like. Yes, it's a simple image made on MS Paint, but it gets the message across. Now, before I go into an explanation of each section, I would first like to explain why it looks the way it does, why there are two separate universes. First off, there's the obvious region, which is what Zinnia says during the post-game Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. MatPat over on Game Theory talked a little bit about the Pokemon multiverse and voiced over this exact part.
That is an impressive machine. Snap your fingers, the asteroid vanishes, and we all live happily ever after? Ah ha 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 ha! Indeed. It's like that former champ said, this thing is the best hope we have of saving this planet and everything on it. But you know, it could also be the worst tragedy imaginable for some other world and everything on it. My people know it. From generation to generation, we pass along the lore about the distortions in the world born by the mega evolution mechanism, and about the existence of another world, which we have long observed to be just like this one, and yet not the same. That's right, a Hoenn region that's almost exactly like this one we live in, filled with Pokemon and people like us. A world where maybe the evolution of Pokemon took a slightly different path, where mega evolution is unknown. A world where that war 3,000 years ago never happened. A world where the ultimate weapon was never even built. End quote.
Now, the rest of his video differs a bit from the Pokemon multiverse theory that most people accept as fact nowadays, as he applies this to why two versions of most Pokemon games exist, such as Ruby and Sapphire, Gold and Silver, or Diamond and Pearl, and so on. This is not what I, or most Pokemon fans, believe the Pokemon multiverse theory to be, and nor does Zinnia. She specifically says a Hoenn region that's almost exactly like the one we live in, filled with Pokemon and people like us, A world where maybe the evolution of Pokémon took a slightly different path where Mega Evolution is unknown. The last part of that quote is the most important. Mega Evolution is in both Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, so regardless of which copy you're playing, Zinnia cannot be talking about the other. She is instead talking about the original Ruby and Sapphire games that took place in the same area but a different universe, one in which Mega Evolution did not exist. That alone is enough for me to believe that at some point the main line of games switched to an alternate universe at some point, but I have more evidence in support of this, mainly the Battle Tower. When you look back at the Battle Tower in the original Ruby and Sapphire, it's on a little plot of land and that's all there is. Flash forward to Emerald, which takes place after Ruby and Sapphire, as confirmed by the switches that take place between Stephen Wallace and Hoenn, and the Battle Tower has now been expanded immensely into the Battle Frontier, all thanks to Scott. So then, when does the Battle Resort from Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire take place? Well, it really doesn't. At least, not in the same universe. The Battle Resort is very well developed, almost beyond what the Battle Frontier was in Emerald, so it almost seems as though it could take place afterward. But upon further inspection, you could find that the Battle Tower is still in process of being created, something that was already done long before Emerald. It doesn't fit into the original timeline at all, and must therefore exist in a timeline of its own. Alright, so now we know that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire take place in a timeline separate from that of Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, and presumably any game that came out before then. But what about Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, Black White, Black 2, White 2, XY, Sun and Moon? Well, this is where I'll concede my theory doesn't have too much substantial evidence. However, based on the original video by Lockstin and Gnoggin, I believe it was Emerald, in fact, that was the last game in the Prime timeline, and that it was Diamond and Pearl that were the first games in the alternate timeline. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to begin to refer to Emerald and everything prior to it as the Prime timeline, and everything from Diamond and Pearl onward as the alternate timeline. Now, the only tiny shred of evidence I'm going off of to believe that Diamond and Pearl started the alternate timeline is that the most important legendaries that Lockstin and Gnoggin talk about in the original video are from Gen 4 onward. And, as I said at the beginning of this video, since I'm accepting the majority of the video as fact, this includes everything from Gen 4 onward being a part of this overarching storyline that the Lockstin and Gnoggin video claims will end in Sun and Moon. So, that explains why my timeline looks the way it does. You start out with the Prime timeline, and then starting with Gen 4, we're suddenly looking at the alternate timeline. The numbers I have above or below each game, or presumed game, is the order I believe they have been or will be released. Now that we understand the layout, we can move on. Now, the Lockstin and Gnoggin video claims that Sun and Moon will be the end of the main line of Pokemon games. Now, while I simply do not believe this, I do agree that Sun and Moon will be an end of sorts. Not the end of the games, not even the end of a storyline. Instead, I interpret it as the end of the world, or at least close to it. I don't believe there's going to be a zombie invasion or some sort of apocalypse, but I do believe there's going to be death and destruction. Lockstin and Gnoggin has another video in which they discuss how they think this death and destruction will be caused by Team Skull trying to raise the dead with a presumed eclipse that will happen in Sun and Moon, and gives valid evidence as to why this may be. While I think it's very possible this may be at least somewhat true, I think the eclipse is going to play a bigger role in the storyline, rather than just being a plot device for a region's evil team's evil plan. In the ending of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, Team Galactic's leader, Cyrus, remains in the distortion world with presumably no way out, right? Well, I believe that if there is to be an eclipse in Sun and Moon, it's going to not only help or interfere with Team Skull's plans, but also open a portal to the distortion world once again. As explained in Lockstin and Gnoggin's Team Skull video, many ancient cultures believe that an eclipse would create portals to the underworld, so while Team Skull raising the dead is a good theory based off of this, especially given that Team Skull's emblem is literally a skull and it's in their name, I believe it's going to actually open a portal to the underworld. And, as we all know, Pokemon's version of the underworld is the Distortion World, where the demon-like Pokemon Giratina rules in opposition to Arceus, the god of Pokemon. And which game was the only game in which the Distortion World was accessible to the player? Platinum. Furthermore, another interesting connection in the original Lockstin and Gnoggin video is that the alchemic symbols for Sun and Moon put together create the alchemic symbol for Platinum. Both the lore and the alchemical connections of the alternate timeline point towards Sun and Moon leading up to Platinum. Now, there's probably a variety of questions you may be thinking. Nintendo never remakes a special game like Yellow, Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum, so why would they start now? Also, why is your Platinum remake in the Prime timeline and not continuing off of Sun and Moon in the alternate timeline? Furthermore, why does it have to be Platinum, and why can't we just move on to a Gen 8 game taking place after Sun and Moon, or at least a special game like some sort of Pokemon Eclipse version? Well, I'm going to try my best to answer those questions. The first question is easy enough to answer. Back in 2012, with the upcoming release of Black 2 and White 2, there was an interview with the Game Freak development head Junichi Masuda, who explained that these two games were being created as opposed to a Pokemon Gray in order to surprise fans who had been expecting it for a while due to Yellow coming out after Blue, Red, and Green, Crystal coming out after Gold and Silver, Emerald coming out after Ruby and Sapphire, and Platinum coming out after Diamond and Pearl. There was a pattern that we had seemed to pick up on, but the creators said that they wanted to surprise us instead, and that they would continue to surprise us in the future. It's because of this that I believe we can't look at previous patterns anymore and rule out a special game remake, simply because it hasn't happened before. In regards to there not being a special game or Gen 8 taking place after Sun and Moon, it entails what I explained earlier about there being some sort of end in Sun and Moon. It could have to do with Team Skull trying to raise the dead, or it may even have something to do with the newly revealed the Ether Foundation. In fact, it might even have to do with the Distortion World and possibly Cyrus. Regardless, I do believe there's going to be some sort of death and destruction that takes place near the end, or after the end, of Sun and Moon, which will prevent the possibility of just creating another game to take place after it without there being some sort of reason or explanation for it. I will come back to this question later on in my theory, where I reveal what this reason and explanation might be, why and how it exists, and how it might keep the future of the main line of Pokemon games afloat. Finally, we get to the question of why my presumed Platinum remake takes place in the Prime timeline and not after Sun and Moon in the alternate timeline. Well, apart from there may being death and destruction taking place, which would logically prevent a Platinum remake from taking place afterward, there's also the fact that most of the remakes take place in the alternate timeline. In other words, remakes of Prime timeline games take place in the alternate timeline. The only exception, of course, is Fire Red and Leaf Green, but we really have no evidence to believe that it's in the Prime timeline either. I have it listed as such because it takes place before Emerald, but it could very well be an oddball and take place in the alternate timeline, although prior to Emerald. Anyway, it's because of this that presumably any remake of an alternate timeline game would instead take place in the Prime timeline. What's important is how the ending of Sun and Moon and or the beginning of a Platinum remake will play into the connection between the two timelines. I believe the storyline of the games and the Distortion World will play a much bigger role than what I've already explained. This is where the real fun part of my theory begins. So, from here on out, most of this theory will be speculation on what the actual storyline will be, starting with the Platinum remake up until the end of my timeline, at which point I'll be able to explain in greater detail how and why the main line of Pokemon games won't end, and what actually happens after the aforementioned death and destruction of Sun and Moon. Let's start with the Platinum remake. As I also mentioned before, the original Platinum had Cyrus getting trapped in the Distortion World. Now, the Distortion World is an interesting place, and it exists outside of time and space. Dialga, the entity of time, and Palkia, the entity of space, have no jurisdiction in that world. It doesn't even exist in a timeline, in fact, and I mean that both in the sense that it doesn't exist in an in-game universe, nor in either the Prime timeline or alternate timeline that I've mapped out. And it's because of this fact that it can act as a connection between both timelines. Furthermore, before I keep going, I would like to point out something else from Lockstin and Gnoggin's second video. Cyrus stems from the Persian word meaning sun, and similarly, Cynthia is the birth name of Artemis, the goddess of the moon. So odds are that both Cynthia and Cyrus will play an important role in Sun and Moon. Also, just as the Distortion World exists outside of any timeline, I believe it may be possible for people to have been created outside of a timeline, even if they seem to have resided inside of one timeline for most of their time. What I mean by this is that when Arceus created the world of Pokemon, it could have easily created people who didn't belong to a specific timeline and just temporarily reside in one. I believe this to be an example of Cynthia and Cyrus. It is because of this that I believe Cyrus is still somewhere in the Distortion World and may very well have the ability to go to any other timeline he wants, with the right tools of course. I also believe Cynthia may have this same ability. But how might Cyrus escape the Distortion World, and how is Cynthia involved in all of this? Well, let's start with Cynthia. Cynthia is from Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and is therefore already in the alternate timeline when we first meet her. This also means that she must be aware of the whole Delta episode ordeal that happens much later in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Meanwhile, Sun and Moon will presumably take place right after Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, so it makes sense that she would make an appearance. Now, let's think about the Delta episode a bit longer. In it, you discover that scientists have the power to open a portal to another universe, aka the Prime Timeline. As I mentioned previously, the only connection between both timelines is the distortion world. In other words, the only way these scientists could create a portal to another timeline is by harnessing the power of the distortion world itself. They were also confident that they could, which means that they must have already gone through a variety of tests. In other words, by the time the Delta episode begins, the rift between the alternate timeline and distortion world was already open. Of course, the last time the rift between the alternate timeline and the distortion world was open, there were a variety of distortions in plain sight, but we haven't seen any of those, right? Well, not quite. As the original Lockstin and Gnoggin video points out, there's a distortion right in Anastar City in X and Y. If you go up to the sundial, you can see an ocean surrounding it with 4 islands in the distance, presumably the 4 islands that we will be on in Sun and Moon. When you check your map, however, there is no ocean near Anastar City, and certainly no islands. It's all just mountainous terrain. Only one thing could distort time and space like that to show you something that wasn't really there, and that, my friends, is the distortion world. Furthermore, because the prime timeline is connected to the same distortion world that the alternate timeline is connected to, it's more than likely that a rift was opened between the prime timeline and the distortion world when the rift between the alternate timeline and distortion world was created as well. This is also most likely what Cyrus was wanting to happen. His goal was to create a new reality, and while he may have failed, going into a new reality is probably the second best thing. At the very least, he could attempt his plan again in the prime timeline and hope for a different outcome. This, of course, would make perfect sense for a Platinum remake because, just like previous remakes, they are similar to the original storyline, but slightly different. Now, let's go back to Cynthia. Well, she was one of the most important champions of any game we've played in either timeline, as she shows up a lot more in your adventure than any of the other champions do. If it's true that both Cynthia and Cyrus were created as beings existing outside of any specific timeline, the scientists' distortion world-based portals or wormholes should have no problem sending Cynthia to the prime timeline. If she does have some connection to Cyrus, not fully explained yet, that might also be the motive Cynthia has to chase Cyrus down to the prime timeline and stop him. As storyline based as this all is, it's my guess that it would all take place as a post-game episode in Sun and Moon, similar to the Delta episode. This would also show the aftermath of whatever death and destruction happens in Sun and Moon and what she tries to do to stop it, most likely with assistance from Steven Stone. Next thing we know, a Platinum remake comes out, taking place right after Emerald in the Prime timeline, and we get to play an adventure similar to the original Platinum, but this time with added speeches from Cynthia and Cyrus about parallel universes and whatnot. Now, your last bit of concern on this may be questioning who the Sinnoh champion would be if there's only one Cynthia and she was the champion of Sinnoh in the alternate timeline. Well, first off, you can have different champions between two versions of a game. Just look at Black 2 and White 2 and compare them to Black and White, where Alder is the champion in one and Iris the champion in another. Also, if she truly exists outside of any timeline, like the Distortion world does, it means that she wasn't supposed to be the champion of Sinnoh in any timeline in the first place. It may have had supposed to be some other guy, let's call them Z. Z would have been the champion of Sinnoh in the alternate timeline, but because this being existing outside of any timeline, Cynthia, was inserted into the alternate timeline, she ended up taking their spot instead. They changed the way the alternate timeline was supposed to proceed. Meanwhile, in the Prime timeline, it's more than likely then whoever this Z person is would have become the champion because there was no influence of Cynthia. So that's about all I have to say on the Platinum remake. As for the rest of my timeline, it's not nearly as complicated as the connection between Sun, Moon, and the Platinum remake is. It's pretty self-explanatory from the picture from here on out. So the next thing you might notice on my timeline is the fact that I have two remakes lined up back to back. Now, this might bother you in regards to this doesn't follow the pattern, but as I've said before, they want to surprise us, and I think this is a perfect way to do it. However, I don't have them taking place right after the Platinum remake. My reasoning for this is that although they want to surprise us, they wouldn't want to bore us with a bunch of remakes either, so they would have to separate these two with something. Now, this spot of course would be Heart Gold and Soul Silver in the alternate timeline, but we can't remake a remake either, at least not yet. The only thing that would fit in this spot would be something brand new, essentially a new gen and a new region, Generation 8. Now, because this would be a brand new thing, I don't have the slightest idea what it could be about, and so I won't talk about it too much. I'm willing to bet, however, that the main story of this game won't play too much into the overall storyline of the timelines. They might add a little post-game story that adds to it, but I don't have any evidence that would point to it or to what it would be about, so I don't think it would be important until a remake of it is made, which I'll talk about when I near the end of my timeline. Anyway, after the new Gen 8 game comes out, that's when they'd hit us with the back-to-back remakes of Gen 5's Black and White, as well as Gen 6 X and Y. We then finally come full circle back to where Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire gave us all the information on timelines. So what might go here? It's already a remake, so we can't remake it again. However, something that would fall into Game Freak's "we want to surprise our fans" mentality would be to make a remake of not only a special game, but a special game of a remake. In this case, Delta Emerald. My reasoning behind this? When Nintendo were copyrighting the names Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they also happened to copyright the name Delta Emerald. And while there's no news to make a Delta Emerald game in the future, I believe they copyrighted this name with the intention of using it at some point in the future. In this case, to mirror the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire storyline in the Prime timeline. This is where things start to fit together like puzzle pieces. You know how Deoxys was once considered a mythical Pokémon, as in, it could only be obtained through an event? Well, that's how it was up through Emerald, which was all in the Prime timeline. And yet suddenly, in the alternate timeline, you can catch Deoxys as if it were a normal legendary. Ever wonder why that might be? Well, in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, as mentioned before, the scientists have the option to send their meteorite to the Prime timeline, but refuse to do so. As this happens in Delta Emerald, because it mirrors Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they would most likely do the opposite and decide to send the meteorite to the alternate timeline. It is this very meteorite that we will end up sending to the alternate timeline that we just recently had the option to send to the Prime timeline in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. And, just like how Deoxys can be found in space in the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald through the event, this Deoxys is then sent through the portal with the meteorite to the alternate timeline, explaining why you can catch Deoxys in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, even though it was usually considered a mythical Pokemon instead of a legendary one. This essentially saves the day for their universe, and the story can end without any of them knowing the events that transpired in the alternate timeline. Next up in the alternate timeline would have been Sun and Moon, and so naturally we can have a Gen 7 remake in this spot in the Prime timeline as well. However, because their counterparts unusually take alternate routes, instead of there being death and destruction at the end, there would instead be happiness. This Gen 7 remake would have a perfect ending to the Prime timeline, a happily ever after. But where does that leave the main line of games? If we reach yet another ending in the franchise in the only other universe known, what else is there? Well, there is one more hole. By this point, every game would have had a remake of it made except for Gen 8 that I introduced earlier. And a remake, of course, takes place in the opposite gen of which it was in. Therefore, a Gen 8 remake would take place in the alternate universe after the events of Sun and Moon. Why not just have an 8th gen after Sun and Moon anyway? Well, because we don't know how it can be created. If the death and destruction are to say anything, it's hard to have any basis on how to start up a new gen from a destroyed world. If we were remaking a game, however, you could make it similar to the original, but based on this new destroyed world. Essentially, with the creation of Gen 8, we can now continue on in the alternate timeline. You would have a game similar to the original Gen 8 game in the Prime timeline, but have it be slightly different in the sense that you're also recreating the world from what's left of it after Sun and Moon. It would essentially be the rebirth that Lockstin and Gnoggin talked so much about in the original video. From then on out, the main line of Pokemon games could continue as usual without any other timelines interfering. It could go on forever. Of course, we know it can't go on forever. Even if it's 50 years from now or more, we know there is going to be one point or another that the franchise has to come to an end. Now, what I'm about to say is complete speculation and has no basis whatsoever, but it's more of what I'm hoping will happen rather than what I believe will happen. When the franchise does come to an end, it's my hope that they will have a climactic ending to the entire franchise where they give us a game that we've always wanted. A game that includes all the previous regions and you can catch all the Pokemon they've created. And the story may even revisit the Prime timeline and allow you to go through the regions in both timelines and be some sort of massive game. As unlikely as this is to happen, it would however make sense as a way to end the franchise by closing both timelines together with one final true ending, and would really have them go up with a bang, both in content and profit. Now, before I end this video, Lockstin and Gnoggin did touch up on the anime a bit, so I would like to say a little something about that as well. I believe Ash and friends are in the alternate timeline and will go through everything I've mentioned. As for the Prime timeline, I actually theorize that they may continue Pokemon Origins and Red's adventures throughout all the regions before Pokemon Generations came out, but now that it has, it only adds more evidence to this theory. By the time Pokemon Generation ends at the end of Gen 7 in the Prime timeline, they may create one more anime that takes place in the alternate timeline after the events of Sun and Moon and have a third protagonist. And by the time they get to the end of the franchise in the final games, they may have some sort of epic special that brings Red, Ash, and this new protagonist together for the first time ever. Again, it's highly unlikely that a special like this would happen, but it's exactly what I'd love to see when the time comes. Anyway, that about covers all there is to my theory. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, questions, and criticisms on my theories, so please comment below if you have the time. I'll try my best to respond to them. Also, if you enjoyed this theory, please give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more theories like this in the future. Feel free to comment any theory suggestions you would like me to do as well. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. So, as I was editing this video, Lockstin and Gnoggin actually posted the third part of the Sun and Moon theory videos. Surprisingly, despite having drawn different conclusions in the first part, a lot of what was said in the third part resembled much of what I've said in this theory that you just watched. Although having many similarities between our two theories, Lockstin and Gnoggin believes that either Sun and Moon or the Platinum remake, whichever one includes more of the story that we've both talked about, will be mainly about the overarching storyline. I know this cannot happen, however, which is why I believe that most anything that would happen along these lines would take place in a post-game mini-storyline, like the Delta episode. This would also allow a Platinum remake to truly be a Gen 4 remake, while still touching up on bits and pieces of the overall storyline. Lockstin and Gnoggin also touches up a lot more on Zygarde, while I didn't really talk about it too much. I couldn't really think of a way to fit it into the theory other than what has already been said in the original videos. Please go watch the third part for a much more in-depth look into it and its relation to Arceus. And once again, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.